Hello, this is Ronnie from The Wool Chemist, and in this video I will demonstrate how to do a provisional cast on with help of a crochet hook directly onto the knitting needle, skipping the step where you have to crochet a chain and then pick up stitches from the back of the chain, which can be a little bit fiddly and a little bit difficult, especially if you're a tight crocheter. This method will put the provisional cast-on stitches directly onto your needle, no need to pick up anything, and you can straight away start knitting with your project yarn. And later on, for whatever reason you need to undo the cast-on, it's gonna be super easy to do. I suggest that you always use a strongly contrasting color for your cast-on. It's gonna make your life easier when you're undoing the cast-on and picking up the stitches later on. So I'm gonna be working with this beautiful burnt heather color when making the clunical, and I will be using this sienna colored string to create my cast-on, which will make my life easier when I'm undoing it later. You need a crochet hook, it can be absolutely any size, and choose the knitting needle that you will be using to work later on for the project. What I like to do is, after creating my slip knot, I will create a very short chain, just about 3-4 stitches long. This will just help me hold on to my yarn while I'm creating the cast-on. Just adding a little tail. And then I pick up the knitting needle, and here is where the magic starts. The only thing to remember is that you always want to have your knitting needle between the yarn, the working yarn, and the crochet hook when you make this cast-on. You're gonna pick up the stitches around your knitting needle. When you're making a chain, without it being a cast-on, you will catch the working yarn with your crochet hook and you will pull it through the loop. You will be doing the exact same now, except there is going to be a knitting needle in the way, so that the back of your chain is going to be a stitch on your needle. Place the working yarn behind your needle, place the chain that you created in front, and you can actually hold this with your thumb to keep them in place. You might find it easier if you leave a really long piece of the needle sticking out that way. If you're gonna try to do the cast-on this close to the edge, it's easier for it to slip off. I like to tension my yarn with my left hand because I'm a continental knitter, but of course you can do this cast-on English style as well, in which case the yarn is just going to be hanging. It's a different method if you're using English, because you're gonna need to throw the yarn around your crochet hook as like so, and it might be harder to then tension it. So I actually suggest that regardless what knitter you are, to try and tension your yarn with your left forefinger by winding it a few times around it. Now for the actual cast-on. Your knitting needle is sitting between the working yarn and your crochet hook, and you're gonna catch the working yarn from the back and pull it through the loop that's currently on your crochet hook. Here you already created your first stitch. It's visible, it's on, sitting on your needle, and this is the very important part of this cast-on. Now you have to ensure that your working yarn goes back behind your knitting needle. So you are going to move it in between your crochet hook and your knitting needle and to the back. And then you are ready for your next stitch. You catch the yarn again and pull it through the loop. If it gets a little bit separated, because like me you have a yarn that is a little bit more loosely wound or spun, just fix it, and then don't forget to put the yarn back behind the knitting needle again. You don't have to be very tight with these stitches. The tension of them actually doesn't matter much, because this is only to hold your stitches in place for later, for working them again later. So that's why it doesn't even matter what size of crochet hook you're using. If you're making them very tight, your first row is just going to be a little bit more difficult to knit. I'm just carrying on, and you are going to do this as many times as what the pattern calls for. If it's 20 stitches, you do it 20 times. If it's 150, you do it 150 times, always remembering after completing the little chain to put your working yarn back behind your knitting needle. I'm going to come really close now. I'm going to do it in really, really slow motion so that you can see. Working yarn is behind the knitting needle and the crochet hook is in front, and I'm going around to catch this yarn and then pull it through this hoop that's on the hook. Here we go. And then I place the yarn back behind the knitting needle. This is the method. It's really not difficult, and it will save you time, not only because it's much easier than to pick up the stitches after you created a chain, but also it makes it very easy to count how many stitches you have because the stitches are already on your needle. I'm just going to do a little sample here, so I'm going to stop at say 20. So I'm just counting up. I actually have 19, so I need one more. So when you have the sufficient amount of stitches, however many you need in the pattern, I suggest that you do just a few more stitches just to keep it steady, and then you are going to cut this contrast colored yarn, and you don't need it for anything, so the tail doesn't have to be long at all, and then you just pull it through to secure it. Here's your cast on, and I'm going to share with you one more little trick that I like to do. When you finished your cast on and you're ready to start working into these stitches with your knitting needle, the crochet hook is now no longer needed. I suggest that you take the starting thread, so this is where you started your cast on, and tie a little knot on it. Because it's quite hard to tell apart later on which was the beginning and which was the end of your cast on, but undoing this cast on can only be done if you undo it from this side. Otherwise, your chain won't unravel and it's gonna be very, very tedious. So I like to tie a knot on my starting end, and I have a little word game that wherever you have the knot, that's the end that you're not going to unravel. I know it's not spelled the same, but it sounds sort of the same, so this might just be a little fun way to remember which end not to unravel when you're finally going to go back and pick up the stitches. The next stage of this cast on is to actually start working the stitches that you have cast on, and you're just gonna switch to your actual yarn that you're gonna use for your project now, and you can start knitting into these stitches as normal. And here's another suggestion: whatever your pattern, if you are going to graft two ends together, and that's the reason why you need this cast on, I always suggest just to do an even row of just knit stitches, because if you're gonna start working in pattern, it's gonna make your grafting a little bit more tricky. And also if there is increases or decreases, the unraveling of this cast on is not gonna be as smooth. So maybe just do a row of knit anyway, and then continue with whatever the pattern tells you, unless your pattern specifically tells you to do whatever stitches into the cast on edge. But maybe read it, because if there is any increases or decreases in the first row, even if it's a setup row, you will find that unraveling your cast on won't be as easy. And this extra little knit row into your cast on will make your life so much easier. So here we go. As you see, it's super easy to just knit into them, and that cast on is just gonna dangle there all the way along until you're finished and you're ready to use them again. If you are knitting in the round, it's the same process. You're not gonna join the cast on itself. You're just gonna knit your first round of stitches and then join your knitting in the round with your actual working yarn. Here we go. Have already completed the first row of stitches, and as you can see, the cast on is just sitting there holding on to to those stitches, so when we finished we can just pick up those stitches onto the needle again. So this is it. This is the provisional cast on with help of a crochet hook directly onto a knitting needle. This can be used for many different reasons, most likely because you will need those stitches for another reason. Either you want to graft these starting stitches with your end stitches, just like in the case of this cowl, when after finishing you join the two ends together and you want to do it seamlessly, which is a nicer way than sewing up the stitches. It's almost invisible. But you can also use provisional cast-ons for many different reasons. Every time you wish to keep these stitches live because you want to use them later on, this cast-on is your go-to.